I would like to start with Ann Herzberg, okay, from NGO Monitor. And could you please give us some kind of an overview of what's really going on? A lot of people are not really connected to the whole thing of Bensouda, the prosecutor, and why is she, picking on Israelis where there's so many things out there? What is the political context on this? And how did NGO Monitor, acted behind the scene and, in front of the scene, if you can say so, to tackle this situation? Thank you, Anne.
Thanks so much for having me. So I want to actually go back to when the criminal court was created back in the late 90s. I think that's really important. NGO Monitor, we are a Jerusalem-based research organization. We've been involved for many years in the ICC campaign, both when the Palestinians tried to join the court in 2009, which I'll get to, as well as the current efforts where we were involved with the partner organizations filing an amicus brief. But I think it's important to look at the context and how the court was founded, because a lot of the issues that came up so some of you listeners may not remember, in the late 80s, there was a move to create an international criminal court. It was following on the years of the conflicts in Rwanda and the Balkans. And the UN had set up ad hoc criminal courts to try individuals in those conflicts. But the world community was really at a point where they thought they wanted to follow the model of the Nuremberg trials after World War II and set up an international criminal court that would cover all situations in the world and would not strictly be one. And it was a very contentious process. They got together in Rome to draft a treaty for this court. And there were three main issues I want to raise that we're now seeing today. Number one, the most contentious issue of all was that of the role of the prosecutor. So many countries did not want to have an independent prosecutor at the court. They wanted the UN to be able to refer cases to the court, and then that would be the cases that the UN would review. But NGOs like Human Rights Watch, especially Amnesty International, several other groups were extremely influential in lobbying the Europeans in particular. And what happened was they appointed a prosecutor who had independent prosecutorial powers. So the prosecutor was granted to decide what cases would be going before the court. So that's the number one issue that was problematic, especially from Israel's point of view. Number two was the Arab countries and Islamic states drove the agenda at the Rome Statute deliberations to change the meaning of war crimes and the Geneva Conventions. The statute of the treaty was supposed to try crimes that were concomitant with that which were laid out at Nuremberg and in the Geneva Conventions. But instead, they altered the language such that the court could potentially tackle Israeli settlement issues. So that was another big issue with the issue of what court would be a universal court or a court only in cases relating to member states. States that had agreed to join the court would be the only states where a prosecutor would have the ability to open cases. So right. If you were not a state, if you were not a member of the court, they could not look at cases in other states.
That's very, and that's very interesting because I remember that Gerard, talking about Gerard Filitti, those of you who don't know him from the Lawfare project, Gerard was mentioning the whole idea that if Palestine is a state, okay, so there are many claims, but one of the claims was that if Palestine is a state, so what is its government? Is it the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria? Or is it the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip? Gerard, what are your thoughts on this? I'm very curious.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Hetz for sponsoring this very important webinar. That is precisely the question that's at issue. There is no government of a Palestinian state. On the one hand, you have the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, which controls less than 40% of that territory. And on the other hand, you have Hamas in Gaza, and arguably they've also made inroads to be the proper governance structure in the West Bank as well. The problem, of course, is that Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's not just the United States and Israel that say this, but other countries, Paraguay, even the European Union identifies Hamas as a terrorist organization. So if you accept the premise that Hamas is the government of Gaza, how is it that the International Criminal Court is legitimizing it? Isn't the purpose of the court to protect people from terrorism, to protect people from atrocities that are committed by governments or so-called governments like Hamas? It strikes me as unbelievable and untenable that an international criminal court would gloss over the fact that the Palestinian leadership is in fact a terrorist organization.
Okay, and so I get it. All right. So there is some kind of a misunderstanding of what is a state and what's his government. And for us, it sounds a bit clear, but perhaps there is some kind of a political context behind this. Is this a clean game? And I want to go back to you, and I apologize in advance for the abruption of your signal. There's some kind of I'm hearing and I'm seeing the chit chat here saying that you're not best heard. But let's just try and get the best clearance from you. What is the political context? What's going on behind the scene? Is Israel being targeted particularly for being Israel? What do you see here?
So for sure. So when they agreed to set up the court, Israel actually originally was very positive towards the court. But because of the provision on settlement and because the court would not define what terrorism was and did not include terrorism as a crime, Israel decided not to ratify the court. So the court came into being in 2002. Israel did not become a member. Now, NGOs were quite angry about this, the human rights community, Palestinians. So in the meantime, they were looking at other ways they could go after Israelis. Now, I think it's important to look at, whether or not an Israeli actually gets indicted by a court or prosecuted. It's also for PR purposes to have Israel branded as a war criminal, to have Israeli actions against terrorism to be branded as war crimes, crimes against humanity. So for beginning in around 2001 up until 2009, a lot of NGOs were trying to get Israeli officials, and we still see it today a little bit, or companies doing business with Israel, trying to get them arrested and prosecuted in Europe, in North America. So all this, Canada, Switzerland, England, Belgium, several of these countries, but these cases ultimately failed. Fast forward to 2009, the Palestinians decide to try to join the court. So even though they're not a state, and as Gerard very eloquently laid out that issue, so in 2009, though, the Palestinians filed a statement with the prosecutor of the court saying they want to join the court. Now, at the time, the prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, should have just said, no, sorry, you're not a state. Being a state is required by the court. And if you're not a state, you can't join the court, sorry. But he did not do that. And that's sort of why we are in the mess we are in today. So what happened was he spent 3 years having academic debates, op-eds in the newspaper, a forum online with University of California, Los Angeles. He had an NGO meeting in 2010 that I actually attended. It was a very small meeting with a group of NGOs and academics. The pro-Israel people there were treated very badly by the prosecutor's office. It was a secret meeting. And so he did all these machinations instead of just saying no. In 2012, he decided to issue a statement saying, no, at this point, the Palestinians are not a state and cannot join the court. But he published a roadmap of how they could join the court. He said if they could become a member of the UN, then they could join the court.
Okay, so what we're seeing here is basically, on one hand, it seems like Israel is being targeted, yeah, or
For sure, for sure.
exempted of other standards. But at the same time, this is not only our problem. This is not the only dispute around the world. There are many others, and I actually want to refer my next question. And by the way, I will just say to anyone, there's going to be 15 minutes at the end to answer the lovely questions that you've been sending us. I want to go back now, actually to go ahead and refer the next question to Yifa. Yifa Segal from the International Legal Forum. It's an NGO with a legal arm to combat injustices, human rights violations, and they have an amazing network, international network, about 3,000 attorneys in 25 countries. And if I understand there's been many submissions, right? Now, I would like to get your overall, impression of the status of this submission. And are we going to see any surprises? Is there a reason to be optimistic? What is your view about this?
Well, hello everybody, and thank you. Well, I have to share with you that I was overwhelmed with the results. Now we don't yet know what the court will decide, so I'm not trying to jump ahead. But if we even go back 2 months, even before the corona started, we didn't know what was going to happen, because the formal Israeli government could not participate in these proceedings because Israel does not recognize the authority of the court. And so it was clear to us that we, civil society organizations, have to be in the front lines here to protect Israel from, this particular legal questions and everything that will follow in the future. And so, first of all, we could not even dream of having so many groups submitting to the ICC in Israel's favor. It's law professors, it's human rights organizations, it's everyone that you see here in the conference call that took part in this, and also many, many others. But I think the biggest and most important surprise was the countries that kind of joined in Israel's defense, arguing that Palestine is not a state, that should not be jurisdiction in this matter over the situation in Palestine, as they say. And if you look at the countries, I mean, European countries like Germany, for example. Germany, as you know, is a leading force in the European Union, and of course also when it comes to the court. So when Germany stands up and says, this is not right, this is not how you should use the authority or apply jurisdiction, I think it really makes a big difference. Or the Czech Republic or Austria. We also seen Uganda and Brazil, and then you saw Canada speak out against this, and other countries as well that have joined, and not in an official way. So I think in a way, this is something that puts us, again, I don't want to be too optimistic, but it does change, potentially, change the game when it comes to, I think, the ICC. I mean, if you ask my opinion, I think the prosecutor must have had a heart attack when she saw these countries submitting these requests. I think she thought that this would be, her claim to fame. This is something that everyone wants to see happen. Everyone wants to see Israel indicted. This is the easiest thing in the world. It's a walk in the park. And then all of a sudden, you see all these countries stand up and say, we're against this. And you see all these civil society organizations and lawyers stand up and say this is wrong.
Rather Jurassic Park than just a walk in a regular park. And I'm actually curious to know, what was your particular part? I mean, what were your arguments? Because you made a submission as well, right? Before just talking about the overall situation. What did you do during this time?
Well, first of all, I think we need to applaud a lot of groups and a lot of lawyers. And like I said, the people here on this call are just a part of it, but amazing people, and the cooperation was remarkable. I think this is groundbreaking in terms of cooperation and coordination that we've seen in the pro-Israel network. Personally, more specifically, we joined up together with the UK LFI Jonathan here is a representative, as well as the Simon Wiesenthal Center UK and the Jerusalem Initiative to submit a submission together. And our part in this, I'm sure Jonathan will elaborate about their part, was in a nutshell, three things. First of all, we claim that the interpretation of the prosecution of what the right of self-determination means is far-reaching and has a very dangerous potential of creating basically chaos all around the world, because she's trying to say that the right of self-determination is somehow equals the right to statehood, and not just the right to statehood, but to have a statehood in a predefined territory, and somehow that actually creates a statehood for the Palestinians. And I think if you look at the world and you try to kind of understand how many minority groups, ethnic, religious, cultural groups, language minorities. I mean, there are so many groups around the world that do enjoy the right of self-determination, but obviously that does not equal statehood. And if you just examine even Western cases without even looking elsewhere, in Spain, for example, Catalonia, and if you look at Quebec in Canada, and if you look at the Venetians or even Bavarians in Germany or in Italy, there are separate groups. And then you'll understand that the courts in each and every case have said that there are other interests that needs to be balanced, and that and the right of self-determination is not enough, not at all enough in and of itself. So that's one argument about the right of self-determination. Second part is the Jerusalem Initiative that partnered with us is a minority group of Arab Christians living in Israel, or specifically living in Jerusalem. And so what we were trying to argue on their behalf is that what the ICC is trying to say basically is that all of a sudden they need to be under PA jurisdiction. And if you examine the history of Christians in Arab countries, and especially under the PA or the Hamas in Gaza, then you see the communities there are shrinking, they're suffering from harassment and discrimination, and you have all these different racist laws. And so by saying that criminal jurisdiction need to be applied, or somehow currently applies to them, I mean PA jurisdiction, then of course then that would mean a unilateral decision by the court that will severely harm both their human rights and even specifically the right of self-determination. And a third thing, just in a nutshell, is just we wanted to highlight the fact that the Palestinians are making contradictory claims, whenever it suits them. So sometimes they want a Palestinian state all over Palestine, including Israel. And if you look at the Arab media, that's all over the place. And in front of the ICC, they're arguing that this is their territory somehow within the 67 borders. And then they go to the ICJ and file a suit against the United States for moving the embassy, and then claiming that somehow Jerusalem is corpus separatum based on the partition plan. So it's an international city without sovereignty, not for Israel and not for the Palestinians. While in the ICC, they're claiming obviously that Jerusalem and of course Bethlehem and all these other areas that were included are also a part of their Palestinian state. I mean, I don't want to go into too many details, but there are so many contradictions, and the Palestinians keep on making different claims. They keep on shifting their views, depend on what is convenient and politically smart for them to do in the moment. So we definitely believe that within the framework of a judicial process, this needs to be addressed by the court and taken very seriously.
Okay, well, so what we're seeing here basically is a big variety of arguments. Okay, we started with Anne, who discussed, the technical arguments that the prosecutor were based upon in UN resolutions, right? And then Gerard was mentioning the role of a government, which government is behind the Palestinian state, right? And you addressed, the element of the relation between self-determination and being a nation or having a state or statehood. But there is another guy right here, Jonathan, who's been sitting on the fence, if I may say so. And as we know, Jonathan, he focused, and with the UK Lawyers for Israel, of course, Jonathan and Caroline and Natasha and all the other great lawyers in their team, they were focusing on arguments that were not covered by definition, were not covered by other submissions. So first of all, I would like to know what are the arguments, but why and how did you get to such a position? I mean, is there a secret collaboration that we can discuss or disclaim, Iran here, or is there a way to understand what is the best argument after viewing all the other arguments?
Well, hello, everyone. We knew by the time we came to make the observations, at any rate, what other people were likely to say, because the International Criminal Court had asked people to submit applications for permission to put in their observations, and direct that those applications must identify must summarize the points that they were going to make. So we had a look at what other people were going to do. And we were aware from that that there were going to be a number of submissions by academics and practitioners of the highest ability and repute. And we will not be adding any value by covering the same points as them, and probably less skillfully. But secondly, and very importantly, the most direct answers to the prosecutor's arguments were somewhat negative points. There were things like Palestine is not a state because it is not in control of the relevant territory and therefore doesn't satisfy that point in the Montevideo criteria, which define what is a state in accordance with normal international law, or that the court is not competent to decide whether Palestine is a state, and so on. And based on my experience as a practicing advocate, as a barrister here in London, I felt that however valid these arguments are, and they are very valid arguments in legal terms, but they can seem somewhat technical and unmeritorious if there's no positive case being put forward in favour of Israel. And that especially as the court has been presented with a whole load of UN material that's full of anti-Israel distortions, and that's also on top of pervasive misinformation about Israel and a degree of anti-Israel sentiment in human rights circles in which the judges of the International Criminal Court and their assistants, in which they tend to move. So we thought that it would be highly desirable to put a more positive case. And in particular, we focused on the positive case that Israel actually has strong claims, in fact, the strongest entitlement to sovereignty over the very territory in question, East Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. And so these areas cannot be regarded as the territory of any state of Palestine. And this is even though Israel's policy is to seek a practical solution by negotiation in accordance with the Oslo Accords, until a negotiated settlement is reached and the final status of these territories is decided. As matters stand, Israel actually has the stronger claims, and in legal and historical terms, it's a very strong case. And by presenting this case, we were able to do also a fair amount to set the historical record straight. And I hope that the judges will read it. Now, Eran, do you want me to go on and try and describe in more detail the
well, I'm quite curious about, what we're seeing here. And also, if I discuss this, that there's been so many submissions, by NGOs and individuals. And I mean, no one really expected it to be so big. And how do you explain this?
Well, it was to be expected that a large number of submissions would be made by anti-Israel NGOs. They are well organized, well financed, and frankly, they've stolen a march on us in recent years in exploiting international law and international bodies to undermine Israel. I think opponents of Israel realized much earlier than we did on our side the increasingly important role being played by NGOs alongside the more traditional state and intergovernmental organizations, although I would pay tribute to NGO Monitor particularly, which has played a very important role in exposing this development so that we can understand something about what's going on here. And so this was one of the main reasons why we formed UK Lawyers for Israel back in 2011, and why Yifa Segal developed the International Legal Forum, and Brooke Goldstein created the Lawfare project to respond to this lawfare and hopefully turn the tables on our opponents. And we've all worked very hard over the last nearly 10 years to develop the capability and networking on our side, and our experience in how to handle this kind of situation. And I think we are getting there. I think we did a very good job responding to the attempt to get Israel suspended from FIFA, and a fairly good job in relation to the boycott bill in Ireland. But I don't think we should rest on our laurels. I think we could have done better and would have done better in the present ICC case, despite what Yifa said. I think we could have done even better with a bit more communication between pro-Israel organisations than we actually had, and frankly, more resources. And I would say this, if I may, we're fantastically good value comparing what we achieve with the cost. And if there are any Israel supporting philanthropists in the audience, I really would urge you to consider supporting the work of my colleagues here and our own organisation, UKLFI. So that's just a quick plug, if I may.
Your advertisement. Of course, we will send some information, and whoever would like to support the NGOs at such a difficult time in terms of cash flow, we all know it, you're all welcome. You mentioned one point about the whole, closed circle of NGOs who are acting against Israel. And there is the whole notion of, being described as a human rights organization, and thus, and as an NGO human rights organization, meaning you're not a government. So by this, a lot of the policymakers are avoiding making any fact-checking against NGOs and accepting what's going on inside the inner circles of such NGOs. So one of them would publish a report, right? And the other would take the report and, publish it as as news, and others will respond it in a coordinated fashion through their Twitter accounts and through their Instagram accounts. And we know well from Hetz and from other sources that they are very well coordinated and centralized in the way that they, things do not really happen spontaneously. And I want to actually take this to Anne, because in NGO Monitor, you're seeing the money trail among other things. And I think that the risk here, and going back to our topic around the ICC, is that these so-called facts, only because, they've been voiced by so many different parties, are becoming arguments in a legal, in a legal battle. So is there a risk for this, to become something that is more solid against Israel in tribunals?
Oh, for sure. I just think it's very important to note on, we were talking about all these submissions that were very good actually on Israel's side, but there were a number of Palestinian NGOs that submitted also to the court. It's really important to know that all of those groups were funded by European governments to file those submissions. Denmark, Switzerland, Sweden, the Netherlands, they all have been giving money to those organizations to file things with the ICC. And the NGOs have been the primary lobbyists to have this case go forward. And without those NGOs, this case would not have been going forward. Also, several of the people who work in these NGOs have also in the past worked in the prosecutor's office. So they're very friendly with these people. It's very influential. Some other interesting notes are, when you look at, so one of the NGOs that filed a submission cited to several UN reports as backing up their claims. But when you look at the UN reports were copying that NGO's claims without doing any verification. So they're citing themselves, but they're not, basically they give it to the UN puts it in a report, and it's sort of UN washed into becoming a fact, a legal fact that then the court will use. And I think the main danger that I see, and this is certainly true in UN frameworks, and I hope that, well, I don't know. I would hope the ICC would be better because it claims to be a real court, and real courts should be better. But I think the danger is that these claims will not be verified. They will not be investigated. They will be presented. The prosecutor, her whole case, and she's done this in other countries, is just copying reports from Human Rights Watch, from other NGOs, and they gives that to the judges. And what we saw in the flotilla case, judges' opinions in the flotilla case repeat a lot of those NGO claims without doing any legal analysis of their own. And I do find that highly problematic. I think it's a tremendous, it is a tremendous threat, because basically what they say then becomes, truth, which could then have, in this case, it's a criminal court. So not that I think there'll be any trials of Israeli officials. I think that would probably be very unlikely, but they could issue arrest warrants that are not known. And let's say an Israeli official travels to Europe, that warrant might be executed. So there's a possibility. And because it's a criminal court, this court has the ability to put someone in jail. So it's not just, some UN report coming out or they say some bad things about Israel and maybe that'll have an impact, on boycotts or something. This is serious stuff. It's criminal sanctions. So I do think we have to be very careful. And honestly, I think going forward, Israel, this has definitely been a trend in so many international type organizations like this. Honestly, I think, countries that care about the rule of law, care about, institutions not being hijacked by a very small group of people with nefarious agendas, really need to think twice about whether or not they want to participate in these institutions. I think that's really going to be a question going forward.
Okay, so what we're hearing here that basically, unlike the the UN Human Rights Council, that is automatically making claims against Israel and passing resolutions, our best ally, that is the United States, withdrew from the committee. And I actually want to ask you, Gerard, as an American. So there are many parallel lines between the case against Israel and some crimes committed by the U.S. in different conflicts. Now, what is the next step going after the U.S.? Having Donald Trump arrested for taking out what's his name, al-Baghdadi. What's next?
Well, I think you've hit on what part of the problem is, that the court is in many ways delegitimizing itself by pursuing investigations or situations over which it has no jurisdiction. Neither Israel nor the United States ever signed the Treaty of Rome. They are not parties to the International Criminal Court. The court doesn't have native jurisdiction over them. Yet in the case of the United States, in the situation in Afghanistan, after the prosecutor insisted on appealing the pretrial chamber's ruling that there was no basis to exercise that jurisdiction, now the court came back and said, guess what? There's an investigation. The court can investigate the alleged crimes. It's very much in parallel to what's going on in Israel. You have a politically motivated investigation because you're looking at two states that have never joined the Treaty of Rome. They're not members of the court. There's no basis of jurisdiction, but the court is saying somehow that there is. And what's interesting here is that there's no, as has been brought up before, this is putting Israelis and Americans at some practical risk of arrest or detention. But worse than that, it's delegitimizing an institution that has done some good in the world when it comes to prosecuting African warlords. Now all of a sudden they're going after, for lack of a better phrase, countries that it has no business investigating. The United States and Israel have very robust legal systems, among the best in the world. We have investigated allegations of wrongdoing on our own and have convicted many people who have been found guilty of wrongdoing. And that's exactly what the International Criminal Court is for. It's meant to step in when a country can't investigate or prosecute crimes that are committed. So how is it then that the ICC is involving itself in two countries over which it has no jurisdiction and which both have investigated and prosecuted where appropriate wrongdoing? This seems to be more politically motivated than anything else.
Right. So just, thinking of ISIS, is ISIS going to go tomorrow and, go to the ICC and say, there's been crimes against us committed by, I don't know, a Western country? What is the definition of a state? Because they call themselves a state, right? The Islamic State. What is the definition of a state? There is the Montevideo criteria, if I'm not mistaken, right? Can you elaborate on this, please?
Well, sure. First of all, there is no definition of state written into the Rome Statute that founded the ICC. So for what a state is, we have to look at customary, general international law. And that, we have the Montevideo Convention, which established a set of 4 criteria to evaluate or test whether there is a state. And that includes the 4 elements of a defined territory, a permanent population, a government in total control of the territory, and the capacity to engage in foreign relations. Now, ironically, you brought up ISIS. I would make the argument that ISIS is more of a state than the Palestinian Authority. At its peak, it had a defined territory. It had a population it kept trapped in its borders. It had a government in absolute and total control of its territory. And it was engaging it had the capacity at least to engage in foreign relations, which it did with Iran and other backers. So by that standard, ISIS is more of a state than the Palestinian Authority or Palestine. And it's interesting because those 4 elements of statehood are not met by Palestine. There is no defined territories. The Palestinians agreed in the Oslo Accords to hold off on declaring a state or accepting a territorial limit. This is all subject to negotiation, to ongoing negotiation. Likewise, there's no permanent population, in part because there are no borders that were set, but also because the issue of repatriation of citizens or nationals and the status of settlements in Jerusalem were left for further negotiation. Now, a government in total control of the territory, I started with that earlier. On the one hand, you have Fatah. On the other hand, you have Hamas. So you don't have one single government in control of any perceived territory. And finally, the capacity to engage in foreign relations. Well, when you don't have the first 3, where's the 4th? And Hamas, a terrorist organization, it's free to buy weapons from Iran, but I don't think that constitutes an act of foreign policy. That's an act of furtherance of terrorism. So by these definitions in the Montevideo criteria, there is no state of Palestine. Going back to what I said before, this is why this is a politically motivated prosecution. Because when you look at what the definition of a state is, when you look at what the criteria is under international law, this case doesn't meet it. There's no basis for jurisdiction, there's no state of Palestine, but the prosecutor is still going after Israel as she is going after America. So the question then becomes why? And I think we all know the answer to that.